Welcome to Silent Screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1: The Vanishing Tide. The coastal town of Ravenmoor was as quiet as the waves that lapped against its rocky shores. Tourists rarely ventured here, their interest waning after hearing the stories, the tales of boats swallowed by fog and captains who never returned. For Ethan Grayson, however, these tales were irresistible. An expert in maritime legends, Ethan had spent years chasing the stories of ghost ships. The latest reports from Ravenmoor pointed to a ship called the Elysium, last seen in 1862. Legends claimed it reappeared once every decade, shimmering on the horizon as twilight fell. Ethan found the diary in a dusty corner of the local library, its leather binding cracked with age. The entries within spoke of Captain Adrian Harlow, who had captained the Elysium. The final pages were frantic, detailing how the crew fell to madness after recovering an ancient artifact, a jade idol said to curse those who touched it. The last line chilled Ethan. "Beware the tide that takes us, for it shall come for you too." The locals were hesitant to talk, their faces pale as they whispered of lights dancing on the waves and voices calling their names. One fisherman, Caleb, finally agreed to take Ethan out at dusk. "It's just stories," Caleb muttered as they set sail. "But stay out too long, and you'll find out why people leave offerings at the shore." The fog rolled in like a living thing, swallowing the boat whole. Then Ethan saw it, a massive silhouette rising from the mist. Lanterns flickered along its railings, and ghostly figures moved about the deck. The Elysium was no longer a tale, it was real. A sudden storm forced them closer. Caleb shouted for them to turn back, but the current was too strong. The ghost ship loomed closer until their vessel struck its hull. Desperation turned to terror as they were forced aboard. The air was thick with decay. Ethan and Caleb stumbled through the spectral corridors, their footsteps echoing unnaturally. Whispers surrounded them, the disembodied voices of the long-dead crew. In the captain's quarters, Ethan found a logbook detailing the final days of the Elysium. The jade idol had been stolen from a sacred temple, and the crew's betrayal of one another sealed their fate. Captain Harlow, desperate to save his men, performed a ritual to bind their souls to the ship, sparing them from death but condemning them to eternal torment. The logbook described a way to break the curse, return the idol to the sea. But the cost was clear: one soul must willingly take the crew's place. Ethan found the idol, its jade surface glowing faintly. The crew materialized, their translucent faces twisted in agony. They surged forward, desperate to stop him. As the storm raged, Ethan stood on the deck and chanted the incantation from the logbook. The idol burned in his hands, the glow intensifying as the waves rose higher. Caleb screamed for Ethan to stop, but it was too late. The idol dissolved into the water, and the ship began to crumble. Ethan's body glowed with the same ethereal light, his form merging with the ship as it was pulled into the depths. Caleb awoke on the shore, his memory a haze. The townsfolk found him raving about the Elysium and Ethan's sacrifice. Days later, Ethan's journal washed ashore, its final entry written in his hand. "The tide has taken me, but the crew is free. Beware the call of the sea, for it whispers still." Ravenmoor never saw the ghost ship again. But on foggy nights, fishermen claimed to hear a voice in the wind, a warning from the man who vanished with the Elysium. Story 2: The Phantom of the Abyss. On a cold, moonless night, The vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean stretched into a seemingly infinite void. For the crew of the Elysian Gale, a modern cargo ship hauling goods across the seas, it was meant to be another uneventful journey. But when a thick, unnatural fog descended without warning, the monotonous hum of the ship's engine was replaced by an eerie silence that blanketed the deck. Captain Hughes, a seasoned sailor with decades of experience, peered through his binoculars, hoping to make sense of the mist. Suddenly, a dark silhouette emerged from the haze. It was a massive ship, its towering masts tangled with shredded sails that fluttered despite the still air. The sight froze the captain's blood. A galleon, centuries old, drifting eerily toward them. Impossible, he whispered to himself. But as the ship drew closer, it became clear, this was no ordinary vessel. As the ghostly galleon glided closer, the crew of the Elysian Gale stood in a collective trance. The ship's hull was encrusted with barnacles and seaweed, as though it had been underwater for centuries. Faint, flickering lanterns cast an otherworldly glow, and a low, mournful groan seemed to emanate from the ship itself. The captain ordered the crew to change course, but the rudder wouldn't budge. It was as if some unseen force had seized control of the ship. The galleon loomed larger until it was nearly parallel to the Elysian Gale. "Do you hear that?" murmured First Mate Callahan, his face pale as death. A faint melody drifted across the water, an old sea shanty, sung by voices that sounded as though they came from the depths of the grave. Before anyone could react, a piercing scream erupted from below deck. Crewman Daniels had gone to investigate a strange banging sound but never returned. The scream was cut short, leaving only the chilling echo behind. The crew gathered in the captain's quarters, panic etched on their faces. They debated abandoning ship, but the lifeboats were inexplicably missing, their ropes severed cleanly. "I've heard tales of this," said Callahan, his voice trembling. "The phantom of the abyss. They say it appears to lost ships, dragging their crew into the sea to join its damned ranks." Dismissed as superstition by most, Callahan's story was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing on the metal deck. When the crew rushed to investigate, they found no one, but fresh, wet footprints led toward the bow. As the hours dragged on, the Elysian Gale became a labyrinth of horrors. Unseen hands pushed crew members into dark corners. Whispered voices recited old sailors' prayers in languages no one understood. The air grew colder with every passing moment, and the once strong men began succumbing to fear. When Captain Hughes finally ventured onto the deck, he saw them, ghostly figures clad in tattered 18th century naval uniforms, their translucent forms glowing faintly in the mist. They moved with purpose, hauling invisible ropes and shouting commands in a language long forgotten. One spirit, a woman with hollow eyes and seaweed dripping from her tattered gown, turned toward the captain. Her voice was barely a whisper but cut through the roaring silence. "Return what was stolen." Confused and terrified, Hughes demanded to know what she meant. The ghost raised a skeletal hand and pointed to the cargo hold. Gathering his courage, the captain descended into the dark bowels of the ship, where he discovered something he couldn't explain, a rusted chest covered in strange runes. As Hughes opened the chest, the ship trembled violently. Inside were artifacts, coins, jewelry, and weapons that seemed to radiate an unnatural cold. Callahan, who had followed the captain, gasped. "These are relics from the Phantom. Someone must have stolen them from the ocean floor." The realization struck Hughes like a thunderbolt. They were carrying the curse itself. The galleon, The spirits. The horrors, they were all tied to these objects. Desperation gripped the captain. He ordered the chest thrown overboard. But it was too late. The galleon's shadow loomed above them. And ghostly hands emerged from the mist, dragging screaming crew members into the icy waters. In the end, only Hughes remained, clutching the ship's wheel as the galleon swallowed the Elysian gale whole. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the woman's hollow gaze, filled with sorrow and vengeance. Weeks later, a fishing trawler reported seeing an uncharted vessel drifting in the fog. When Coast Guard crews investigated, they found the Elysian gale adrift, its decks empty. The ship's log ended abruptly, with Captain Hughes's final entry: "They have come for what was stolen. The sea keeps its secrets. And now, so do I." No survivors were ever found. But sailors whisper of the Elysian gale. Now another ghost ship haunting the Atlantic. And on stormy nights, some claim to hear the mournful strains of a sea shanty, echoing across the waves, a warning to those who dare to steal from the abyss. Story 3: The Ghost Ship of Eldritch Waters. There are tales sailors whisper about the Eldritch Waters, an expanse of ocean so vast and deep that even the bravest seafarers are known to vanish without a trace. A place where the horizon stretches into infinity, and the water is as dark as ink. But its calmness is deceptive, for beneath its still surface, unspeakable things stir. It was on a stormy night that I first heard of the Blackened Star, a ship so haunted it was said to sail the seas between life and death. No one knows when it first appeared, and no one alive has ever seen it leave. Some say it's cursed, others believe it's the manifestation of a forgotten tragedy. But when my crew and I encountered it, we would wish we had never learned the truth. The Eldritch Queen was no stranger to the treacherous waters that lurked near the Eldritch archipelago. We were seasoned sailors, led by Captain Tobias Harker, a man with an iron will and an unyielding desire to conquer the sea. But even Tobias, with his bravado and stories of past victories, knew to tread carefully near these cursed waters. On the third day of our voyage, we encountered the first signs of something wrong. A dense fog rolled in from the horizon, suffocating the wind and dulling the world to a muted gray. Our compass spun erratically, and the stars above seemed to blink out one by one. By the time the fog lifted, we were no longer in familiar waters. A strange stillness hung in the air. The sea was unnaturally calm, and the sky, once filled with the sharp edge of daylight, had become a brooding, unnatural shade of crimson. That was when we saw it, the silhouette of a ship against the darkening sky. Its sails were tattered, and its hull seemed to blend into the gloom, as though it were not entirely there. The Blackened Star. Curiosity drove Captain Harker to approach, despite the instinct that told us to turn back. As we neared, the crew became eerily silent. None of us had ever seen a vessel in such a state. The wooden planks of the ship's deck were cracked, and the smell of rot hung in the air. But there were no signs of life, no crew, no movement. It was as if the ship had been abandoned for centuries. We dropped anchor and boarded, the wood creaking beneath our feet. It didn't take long for us to realize the ship was not as deserted as it seemed. There were strange markings on the walls, symbols we could not decipher. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the very space was alive with something that didn't want us there. Then we found the bodies. The crew of the Blackened Star had been there. We realized. Their lifeless forms were sprawled across the ship's quarters, twisted in unnatural positions, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. They had been dead for weeks. Perhaps months. But what disturbed me most was the way they died. Their eyes had been torn open. As if something had forced them to see beyond the limits of human comprehension. Their hands were outstretched. As though they had been reaching for something just beyond their grasp. We retreated quickly. But not before hearing a faint whisper, barely audible over the creaking of the old ship. The captain knows. Captain Harker, visibly shaken, ordered us to return to the Eldritch Queen immediately. But the ship would not start. The engines sputtered and died. We were stranded. As night fell, something shifted on the blackened star. We could hear footsteps on the deck. Though no one was visible. The air grew colder. At first, we thought it was just the wind. But then, one by one, the crew began to disappear. The first to go was Thomas. The youngest of us. He had wandered into the ship's galley, following a sound that didn't belong. We never saw him again. Then, as if something were picking us off one by one, others vanished. We could hear the whispers growing louder. And the temperature plummeted. The captain knows. Terror gripped us. But there was nothing we could do. The ship had become a prison. A nightmarish place from which there was no escape. The last survivors of the crew gathered in the captain's quarters. Captain Harker, pale and trembling, was no longer the man we once knew. His eyes had turned dark. As if the shadows themselves had claimed him. It was not supposed to happen like this, he whispered. His voice hollow. We were supposed to be the ones to find it. To take it back. The ship, it's been calling me. It was then I understood, the blackened star was not a ghost ship. At least not in the way we thought. It was a vessel that had once carried a terrible burden, a crew that had unknowingly entered into a pact with something beyond our world. As the captain spoke, the ship groaned. Its timbers shifting as if it were alive. Then, the sea began to churn. The surface of the water rose, forming waves that hit the ship with a force none of us could have imagined. Then, from the depths, something rose. A monstrous shape broke the surface. Massive and grotesque. The blackened star seemed to bow to it. And from the depths, a voice, ancient and malevolent, whispered. You are mine now. The creature rose fully from the depths, a grotesque, titanic thing that seemed to be a mixture of shipwrecked debris and rotting sea creatures. Its eyes glowed with a cold, malicious light. And its maw opened to reveal rows of jagged, rusted teeth. The blackened star began to list. Its timbers cracking under the weight of the beast. I could see the shadowy figures of the past crew emerging from the darkness, dead but not gone. Their bodies twisted and deformed by the creature's influence. I ran, as fast as I could, back to the Eldritch Queen, hoping against hope that we could escape. But as I looked back, I saw the ship's form shifting, bending into the sea, as if it were sinking back into the depths from where it had come. And then I realized, there was no escaping it. The blackened star had always been part of the abyss. A vessel built to carry souls into the dark. We were meant to join them. The last thing I remember was the sound of the sea crashing. And then, nothing. Weeks later, a rescue crew came looking for us. They found the Eldritch Queen, abandoned and drifting in the same waters. But there was no sign of the blackened star, no wreckage, no trace. The crew spoke of hearing whispers in the wind, voices that seemed to call out from the depths. And every sailor who set foot on the abandoned ship spoke of the same thing, a cold, Unexplainable terror that filled the air. A sense of doom that refused to fade. They say the blackened star still sails the Eldritch waters, waiting for the next crew foolish enough to venture too close. And those who hear its whispers will know that there is no escape, not from the ship, and not from the thing that commands it. The ghost ship of Eldritch waters will always return.